It was a Tuesday morning, glass-smooth water on Lake Whisper, and I was sitting on my dock, watching the great blue heron fish, sipping coffee. You know, the kind of quiet that just resets your soul, when suddenly, a voice that could curdle milk shattered everything. "Get that disgusting hulk off our waterfront now." That was Beatrice Thorne, president of the Whispering Pines HOA, and she didn't just walk onto my property. She stormed it, blazer crisp, clipboard clutched like a weapon, with two uncomfortable-looking board members trailing behind her like reluctant witnesses to a crime. She was pointing her phone camera at my boat, my beloved 15-year-old Sea Sprite 1800, which I called the Relic, like it was toxic waste that had just washed ashore. I swear, the sheer audacity took my breath away. She was standing on my private dock, the one my dad and I built 25 years ago, demanding I remove my legally registered fishing boat because she didn't like the aesthetics. This woman, Beatrice, believed her opinion was an actual federal statute, and she was about to learn a very expensive lesson in property law and humility. I'd owned this place for 2 decades, paid my taxes, maintained every damn plank of wood on this dock, and now this perfectly coiffed tyrant was screaming about property values and community standards. She gestured wildly at the Relic, which, okay, wasn't a yacht. It had some weathered paint, a few honest scuffs from years of good service, but she ran perfectly. She was a working boat, and she was mine. I set my coffee cup down, deliberately slow, and watched her performance. Red-cheeked indignation, the absolute certainty of someone whose biggest problem in life was an imperfect color palette. She wore her authority like a uniform, and I knew instantly. This was a person who had never once been told no by anyone who actually mattered. "Mrs. Thorne," I said, keeping my voice low and conversational, which is the best way to handle a shrieky person. "You force them to either match your calm or look utterly ridiculous. This is private property." The dock was built in 1999, before the HOA was even incorporated in 2003. "I don't care when it was built, Mr. Dalton," she snapped back. "It's visible from common areas, and it affects the community aesthetic. We have every right to demand compliance." She then consulted her clipboard, reading notes that looked hastily typed. "Marine vessel, deteriorating appearance, Class A eyesore violation, immediate removal required." One of the board members, a nervous guy named Frank, cleared his throat. "Beatrice, perhaps we should cite the specific regulation." She cut him off with a look that could freeze water. "The standards are self-evident, Frank. Any reasonable person can see this. This floating garbage is inappropriate for Whispering Pines." That phrase, floating garbage, self-evident standards, I filed it away. Subjective judgment presented as objective fact. That was the core of her strategy, and it was the rope I was going to use. I didn't argue. I just nodded. "I understand your position completely, Mrs. Thorne," I replied, which clearly stunned her. She came expecting a fight, but found quiet acceptance. "What time frame are we looking at for compliance?" 14 days, she said, regaining her smug composure. "Remove it, or bring it up to standard. And let me be clear, Mr. Dalton, cosmetic improvements won't be sufficient. This vessel needs to go." She handed me the formal notice, pre-printed, naturally, and I folded it neatly, sliding it into my pocket. 14 days. That seems reasonable for making such an important decision. I let the ambiguity of that last word linger, just to keep her guessing. After they left, the silence returned, but the peace was gone. My dad, who taught me to fish right here, also taught me that bullies rely on intimidation because they rarely have substance behind their bluster. I pulled out my phone, started a new folder, Beatrice Documentation Project, and began typing every quote, every timestamp, every facial expression I could remember. Beatrice assumed I was helpless. She assumed vague authority plus aggressive intimidation would overwhelm resistance. She didn't realize she was dealing with a guy who approaches conflict with the same methodical patience he uses to organize his tackle box: inventory, research, and precise execution. A few days later, the certified mail arrived. 3 pages of dense, pompous bureaucratic language, transforming her aesthetic tantrum into official policy. It claimed my boat significantly impact community property values, but, critically, nowhere did it cite a specific regulation, define community standard, or establish objective criteria for violation. It was all smoke and mirrors. I realized I couldn't fight this alone. I needed to see the larger pattern. My first stop was across the cove, at the house of a woman named Susan Miller. Susan had recently gone toe-to-toe with Beatrice. $3.50 fine for the fence stain, Susan whispered, bitterness dripping from her voice. Apparently, my river mist gray had an unacceptable urban tone that didn't harmonize with the established lakefront pastel aesthetic. Urban tone. It's gray, Ken. It's gray. Susan had stacks of correspondence documenting the same vague accusations and subjective interpretations. Next, I visited the Andersons. They were threatened with legal action because their kids put up one of those whimsical mailbox decorations, a ceramic puffin holding a little fishing pole. A puffin, Mr. Anderson said, shaking his head. A puffin. Beatrice said it was an inappropriate lawn ornament that detracts from community dignity. My kids were devastated. We took it down immediately, but that's the playbook. Ken, they target the ones who seem least likely to fight, the busy or the elderly, and rely on fear. The pattern was unmistakable. Beatrice wasn't enforcing rules. She was imposing her own personal taste, using the HOA letterhead as a shield, and isolating residents one by one. Her power rested entirely on the assumption that no one would actually read the fine print or question her authority. That evening, I called her. I needed one more piece of crucial evidence. I affected a voice of defeated cooperation. Mrs. Thorne, I got your notice. I want to work with the community here, but I just need to understand the standards. What exactly qualifies as appropriate versus inappropriate under the community guidelines? She practically purred with satisfaction. She thought she had me cornered. Mr. Dalton, this is not complicated. Reasonable people can tell the difference between what belongs in Whispering Pines and what does not. Your boat does not. I pressed gently. So it's a case-by-case judgment call, based on the board's assessment of what seems appropriate? Exactly right, she declared, her tone radiating smug authority. The board has full discretion to maintain community standards as we see fit. That's exactly what we're elected to do. Perfect. An admission, recorded on my phone, that their enforcement was arbitrary, discretionary, and based entirely on personal preference. She had just publicly claimed unlimited authority resting on a subjective opinion, and I knew that statement was legally indefensible. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office. This is where I found the true dynamite. First, the original dock construction permit from 1999. It predated the HOA's incorporation by 4 years, giving me what's called grandfathered status. The HOA had zero authority over the structure itself. Second, a minor boundary resolution I'd commissioned back in 2015. It clearly showed that my dock, and the stretch of waterfront where the relic was moored, fell into a disputed jurisdiction zone outside the current platted HOA community boundaries. They'd been operating on outdated maps for a decade. Beatrice had been making demands she had zero legal right to enforce. Her entire campaign was based on an assumption that was demonstrably, factually false. I closed my file, leaned back in my chair, and smiled. Let her think she was winning. Sometimes, the best strategy is letting your opponent commit fully to a position they can't actually defend. 3 days after my deadline expired, the war arrived, not with a whimper, but with the sound of a massive diesel engine. 7:30 a.m. on a Saturday, and Beatrice Thorne rolled up in her black SUV, followed by an enormous flatbed tow truck that looked capable of hauling a semi-trailer. Bringing up the rear were the 2 nervous board members, Frank and a woman named Sarah, who was filming the whole thing on her phone, presumably for Beatrice's social media feed documenting her heroic efforts against lakefront degradation. I was already on the dock, casually adjusting my mooring lines. Mr. Dalton, Beatrice announced, clipboard ready, voice. Ringing with theatrical official business. The compliance deadline has expired, and your vessel remains in violation. The board authorized removal. Allied Towing is here to complete the action. I straightened up slowly, wiping my hands on a shop rag. Good morning, Beatrice. Based on what specific authority are you planning to remove my boat from my private property? I made sure the tow truck driver, a weathered guy named Roy, could hear me. Roy scratched his chin, looking from Beatrice to me to the sea sprite. Ma'am, the work order just says community violation and board resolution. That ain't a court order. I'm gonna need something from law enforcement or the county before I touch private property. Beatrice's smile tightened into a grim line. The resolution is sufficient. The association has full authority to enforce its standards. Ma'am, respectfully, Roy replied, crossing his arms, adopting the familiar stance of a working man who's been down this road many times. I need real paperwork. Police involvement or a judge's documentation. Association disputes ain't enough for me to remove somebody's property. Not in this county. Neighbors were starting to emerge, drawn by the commotion. Susan Miller on her porch, the Andersons standing near their mailbox, watching. Beatrice, noticing the audience, seemed to interpret it as validation. As you can see, the community supports maintaining proper standards, she announced loudly. We won't tolerate residents who think the rules don't apply to them. Then, the true genius moment. The moment I had hoped for. Frustrated by Roy's resistance and desperate to salvage her authority, Beatrice made the final, catastrophic strategic error. Listen carefully, everyone, she shouted, her voice shaking slightly. The HOA board has absolute authority to remove anything we determine to be inappropriate for community standards. Boats, decorations, landscaping, anything we find aesthetically unacceptable will be eliminated. That's our responsibility. I stepped forward, keeping my voice calm, helpful, almost analytical, ensuring every neighbor and the board members could hear the exchange. Just to clarify, Beatrice, I said, you're confirming that the HOA claims authority to remove any property that board members subjectively find unattractive, regardless of legal ownership or actual written regulations. Exactly right, she snapped, too angry to recognize the trap. Full authority to maintain community quality standards, without exception. Roy shook his head, climbed back into his cab, muttering something about HOA power trips, and drove away, leaving only tire tracks and a furious Beatrice. The confrontation was over, but the war was just beginning. A week later, Inspector Graves from County Code Compliance showed up at my door. Apparently, after the tow truck fiasco, Susan, the Andersons, and several other neighbors had collectively flooded the county office with complaints, finally pushing the issue onto the active case list. The formal review was scheduled for the next Saturday on my dock. Beatrice showed up with a slick attorney, a briefcase full of documents, and her entourage, wearing the confidence of a seasoned warrior. But I was ready. I wasn't just defending my boat. I was defending the entire community's right to not be governed by the arbitrary whims of one person. When it was my turn to speak, I let Beatrice's attorney finish his technically sound but legally hollow presentation. Then, I bypassed my boundary claims entirely and went straight for the logical inconsistency. Inspector Graves, I said, addressing the county official while keeping my eyes on Beatrice. I have just one question for Mrs. Thorne. You claim the HOA has the authority to remove anything that is aesthetically unacceptable, correct? Beatrice, unable to resist asserting herself, confirmed, of course. We address anything that damages neighborhood character. And that standard applies to everyone equally. I pressed gently. It applies to all aspects of community life, she replied, walking straight into the fire. I opened my folder and began presenting the case against the HOA board itself. Following the exact standards Mrs. Thorne established, I continued, my voice steady. I'd like to file a formal complaint about aesthetic violations committed by the HOA board. Based on their own criteria of community impact and reasonable standards of appropriateness, I submit that harassment, intimidation, attempted property seizure without a warrant, and bullying behavior constitute the ugliest possible conduct affecting neighborhood character, far more than any weathered boat ever could. I played the audio recording of her public admission. Full authority to maintain community quality standards, without exception. The sound of her own voice publicly claiming arbitrary power visibly drained the color from her face. Then came the flood. Susan stepped forward, detailing the urban tone, fence-stained fine. Mr. Anderson described his children crying over the inappropriate puffin. One older resident, Mr. Hemlock, spoke about being fined because his front porch light fixture was too rustic for the neighborhood's modern colonial feel. The community found its voice. It wasn't about the boat anymore. It was about the reign of petty terror. Frank, the nervous board member, finally found his spine. Beatrice, with all due respect, The community is supposed to benefit everyone. We've gone too far. Sarah, the one filming, put her phone down, looking utterly defeated. Inspector Graves closed his notebook. Mrs. Thorne, based on the evidence, we have identified several significant issues. First, the dock's grandfathered status and its location outside the current boundaries mean the HOA lacked jurisdiction from the start. He paused, letting that sink in. Furthermore, the documented pattern of enforcement based purely on subjective aesthetic judgment constitutes harassment under County Ordinance 15.2.3. Mr. Dalton, as the owner of private property outside the HOA's authority, you have the legal right to establish reasonable access restrictions for your dock area against parties who have engaged in documented harassment. Beatrice made one last desperate, pathetic attempt. You can't let individual residents override community standards just because they don't like being held accountable. Mrs. Thorne, I said, standing to address her directly, calmly, you established the precedent that ugly behavior should be removed from the community. You defined harassment and intimidation as community violations. I am simply applying your own logic consistently. The irony was perfect and devastating. A week later, the certified mail arrived. The county officially recognized my right to control access. I immediately installed a prominent sign at the dock entrance: private property, restricted access, by order of county code compliance. Violation is criminal trespass. Community fishing welcome with owner permission. HOA board members involved in documented harassment are expressly prohibited. Over the next few weeks, they all tried to test the boundary. Frank tried to play peacemaker. Sarah tried to argue discrimination. Beatrice herself tried to stand on the shoreline, screaming about public access. But the answer was the same every time. You are welcome here the day you stop using power to harass your neighbors. Until then, the dock is open to everyone, except the people who tried to take it away. The dock became the most popular amenity in Whispering Pines, a place where the rules were simple, clear, and focused on human decency. And Beatrice? She ended up having to stand on her own property, watching families gather, children learning to cast a line right next to the boat she called floating garbage, which now proudly wore the title of community education vessel. The ultimate irony? The ugly boat became the reason property values went up. Turns out, ugly and beautiful aren't really about appearance. They're about how you treat people. I want to know what you think. Who was truly the villain in this story? Was I wrong to ban the entire board, even the quiet ones, for the actions of the president? Drop your thoughts, your own HOA horror stories, and your take on where the line is between community standards and outright bullying in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories of little guys fighting back against the big machine. Peace out.